Hello, my name's Melanie Roides and I'm a calligrapher and an oil painter. And this exhibition right now is going on in the Morrison Gallery, Elizabethtown Community and Technical College. It's wonderful to be able to display work in a gallery setting with the track lighting. And although my training is in graphic arts, I turned to oil painting later on. Everything in this exhibition is either oil on panel or ink on parchment. I'll tell you more about the technique and how that's done after we go through each of the paintings or pieces of calligraphy respectively, and also show you some of the tricks of the trade, what I use, what the medium is. Medium here you're using is the camera, mine are pens and brushes, more of that later. This is actually the very first oil painting that I ever did. It's of an Irish boathouse. It's in County Cork. Interestingly, Irish people refer to what county they're from, as we do in Kentucky. I'm from Breck County, or I'm from wherever. In Ireland, they say I'm from County Cork. This is County Cork. It's actually the boathouse of Mockross House, just outside of Cork. And I decided in doing this today that it might be good to put this into a personal, of course, historical and sociological perspective when necessary or appropriate. So this is oil on panel, my first painting, and that's probably all I have to say on that one. I used to work for the American Army and designed re-enlistment posters and certificates of promotion for soldiers. That was when I learned to do calligraphy. This calligraphy here is particularly interesting because it compares two styles of calligraphy. One Carolingian, named for the Emperor Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who was actually a bright spot in the Dark Ages. He was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800, and he put an emphasis on the amassing of knowledge. One obvious way of amassing or transferring knowledge is through writing. So he had scribes who wrote for him, Carolingian named for Charlemagne. This helped spread Christianity in Europe during that dark time, and the style of lettering next to it is Gothic, which, as you can see, is quite different. It's more condensed because ink and parchment were very expensive. Calligraphers had to be quite conservative with how they used their space because this was an expensive enterprise. This here, the medium, is oil on panel, and I'll show you what a panel looks like before it's painted on. It's an old Venetian technique, apparently, to have a red background, which is what's behind all this. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. This is a painting taken from a photograph that I took. In fact, just about everything in this exhibition is taken from photographs that I have taken when I've been traveling. I like to travel. I'm obviously not from here originally, but I've lived here longer than anywhere else. So I feel proud to call myself a Kentuckian. I was born in England, London actually, just outside of the city. Lived in Dover, and I've got a painting of the White Cliffs that I did of Dover. And then I've lived in various other countries, but Kentucky's home because I've lived here now for 31 years, so that's where I hang my hat. This is a photograph that I took years ago when I was out on a walk with my father. I couldn't tell you exactly where it is because I've forgotten. It's lost in the mist of time. But suffice to say, these are English ruins, and that's my rendition of some English ruins. So this painting here is taken from Samothrace in Greece. It's the sanctuary of the great gods. Historians don't really know very much about Samothrace and the great gods who resided there or who were worshipped there. But if anybody is an art aficionado, does anybody recognize who this is? Nike of Samothrace, also known as Winged Victory. And so there was also a thought that perhaps some of the gods who were worshipped on this island were either Dionysian, of that cult, wine and revelry, sounds like a bit of a hoot, doesn't it? Or it could have been of women, hence Nike of Samothrace being shown as a very powerful figure. The original of Nike of Samothrace is now in the Louvre in France, and when we arrived in Samothrace, the morning that we went around the sanctuary of the great gods, there was a pretty poor effigy of Nike of Samothrace on the harbour. It wasn't very well looked after, I have to say, which rather surprised me because I would have thought that was a claim to fame. But this is just an idea of, well, a place of solitude, I suppose, where people might go to relax. This painting is of the Tower of London, which is on the Thames River in England. And due to a happy circumstance, I happened to be travelling up the river when it was a thunderous day, so there was a very majestic sort of sky. Now, accidents happen sometimes when you're painting that you can't always anticipate, and when I did that sky, my intent was just to try to get some of the swirling action that you can see in the photograph. And I use my fingers. Sometimes I don't rely on brushes, I just get hands-on and do things. And one of the ladies I paint with looked at it and she said, "I see an angel in there." I saw nothing of the sort myself. It wasn't my intent. But it's interesting how sometimes things just happen, and what people see in a painting, what one person sees isn't necessarily what somebody else sees, because much as a painting is personal on the part of the person, in this case me, who painted it, actually looking at paintings, any artwork, analysing it becomes personal because you're seeing it through your own individual lens. So what you take from it may be based on many factors that you're not even consciously aware of, an associative memory perhaps of a grandparent or somebody or someplace special to you can sometimes strike a chord, and those things you just never know how people see things or perceive them. And actually Leonardo da Vinci said all of our knowledge has its origins in our perceptions, so it's what you perceive. Leonardo said that, and who's going to argue with Leonardo? All of our knowledge has its origin in our perceptions, and I think that's a pretty interesting thought. So this is one of the tools of the trade, a figure to paint from. Toilet paper. Toilet paper has more than one use. In painting, you often use it, or I use it in the studio, I paint at to blur lines. You don't want harsh lines always, so you blot. You use toilet paper to blot. This is the Tower of London. Henry VIII, who you may know because he had 6 wives, one of whom was imprisoned in this tower, before she was beheaded, might have been relieved to have a role of this. That was a pretty scary time, and she was in fact beheaded. Interesting thing about Henry VIII is his 6 wives follow a pattern. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon, second wife Anne Boleyn, who was beheaded in this tower. Third wife, Jane Seymour. Fourth wife, Anna of Cleves. Fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Sixth wife, Catherine Parr. So, talking about his wives, one of them in a time when there was no photography, so Henry VIII, we'll be talking about maybe somewhere around 1503 onwards, there were no such things as photographs to be sent. His fourth wife, Anna of Cleves, was sent to him by way of a portrait been painted of her, and it was very flattering. He saw the painting and he thought, yes, Anna of Cleves, yeah, she sounds like she'd be a good deal. Until he actually saw her, she was nothing like the painting. So as you and I both know, if you're students of this medium, there are things that you crop, there are things that you embellish, and other aspects that only you know the trick of the trade. That's one of mine. So this is the path to Trout Lake in Yellowstone National Park. I've walked that path many times, and it's called Trout Lake because there is indeed a lake that you can't see beyond the hills here. Yellowstone, interestingly, is America's first national park, and it has a beauty about it and a magnitude that helps one when one is in the presence of such brilliance of nature to realise how insignificant the individual is, puts things in perspective. It does for me anyway. Lovely place. This is a painting of Lyme Regis in England. Regis has to do with the king. Charles I went to Lyme Regis and made it popular. If the king had been there, others wanted to follow. Interestingly, Charles I was the only king of England to lose his crown. Unfortunately, his head was still in it. It was the only king of England to actually be beheaded. Lyme Regis is an interesting place also because it's where these ammonites, if you can see this street lamp, all the street lamps in Lyme Regis have the shape of an ammonite, which is a fossil. They were found on the beaches in Lyme Regis by a woman by the name of Mary Annan. This was around the time, probably late 1800s, when archaeology and paleontology were just becoming a science, a recognised science. Ology just means study of, so anything that has ology at the end of it means study of, as in sociology, study of societies. Interesting how societies work in that, as I said, once the king had been there, everybody wanted to be there. These are baby birds that were hatching in our garden, and it just goes to show that there's beauty everywhere. We're surrounded by beauty, we don't always notice it, but it's there. So when these babies were really tiny, I decided I'd take a photograph of them. This posed a little bit of a problem in terms of perspective, because in order to get the photograph, I had to point downwards into the nest. Trying to paint that was rather difficult, so that was a challenge. You never know what it's going to be until you get into it. But that's why we create, right? This is a painting from imagination, not from a photograph. Poppies, just because I love poppies, and the ginkgo leaf. Red and green, interestingly, work very well together. I've always thought you see it in nature a lot with holly, berries, as opposed to the little prickly leaves. And they're complementary colours, colours that are opposite one another on the colour wheel, always work together to make a statement, actually. So red and green make a statement, and that's from my imagination, that painting. This is the coast of Aragon. As a matter of fact, this scene here is fairly well known in that you have whales who flop around in that general vicinity. I didn't say that very well, but that's the gist of it. It's often used, or it's not often, but I've seen it used in advertisements for cars as a backdrop because it's quite a stunning backdrop. And that is, as students of camera, the power of suggestion. You know, you own this really powerful car and there you've got nature behind you in all its glory. So it's rather interesting. And this is a painting from Greece. It's a little town called Galaxidi, which actually means sour milk, if you translated it. And it is on the Gulf of Corinth, and not far from here is where Lord Byron fought in the Greek War of Independence, but he didn't actually die as a result of injuries incurred in that struggle. He died of an illness, but the myth, the romantic myth, was perpetuated that he died in the cause of the Greek struggle. So Lord Byron's heart is actually buried just up the coast from here in a place called Missolonghi Beach. And there's a huge white effigy in tribute to Byron, who did a lot to get public opinion focused on what was happening in Greece in that time. So two paintings here. The top one is of a European village. The lower one is of an English churchyard. I wanted to talk about this a little bit because really for two reasons. One, I believe in recycling. This is a very old frame. I pick them up at flea markets. I don't like to spend a lot of money on having artwork framed. It costs you a fortune. You can do it yourself at a fraction of the cost. Also, I wanted to point out in this painting that it's taken from a photograph which was rather more panoramic than this suggests. This was a long photo, and because there was a lot of busy stuff on this side that meant nothing really to the overall composition, I just covered it up, which is another way of editing. It's a hands-on kind of field expediency way of doing it, but it's the same idea that you're using when you choose what you're going to give your so-called nose room to. This is a painting of Venice. I was in Venice years ago, and when I took that photograph I didn't realise that years later I would paint it. I'm relatively new to oil painting, picked it up 18 months ago or so, and Venice is the most spectacular place I've probably ever visited as a city, in that the colours in Venice have to be seen to be believed. The beautiful waters and the old buildings, that lovely old terracotta looking effect you have, and the sky and reflections thereof. It's just a wonderful place to visit. This shows the White Cliffs of Dover, where I grew up. I was born in London, but my parents moved to Dover when I was 6 years old. So I grew up in the country, kind of, and this is very special to me, the White Cliffs of Dover. There was actually a song written about it in the Second World War, which I will not attempt to recreate here, or there will be squirrels falling out of the trees if I tried that one. But suffice to say, when I was growing up, I didn't have enough money to ever buy a decent painting of Dover, or a painting. I won't say decent, mustn't blow my own trumpet here, but I did want a nice memory of the White Cliffs, and I could never afford a painting, so when I took up oil painting I thought, well, I'll do my own. So I did, and I painted from a photograph, added the birds. They didn't conveniently show up when I actually took the photograph, so I added them. But this brings back many happy memories. In fact, that's something that painting does, or any time that you record something that's happened to you, it's always a nice way to capture the memory. Create one, capture it for posterity. So yes, that's actually the largest painting that I've done so far. And I got into a bit of a trick with it, because when I had it on the easel, it was so long that when I used my happy brush, and I'll show you what the happy brush does later on, it blurs lines. And when you swipe it across the canvas, this thing was wobbling all over the place because it was so long I couldn't keep it steady on the easel. This is a path in Oregon. I just called this painting Pink Path because, to be honest, I can't remember where exactly I was in Oregon when I took this photograph, when I took the photograph from which this painting is made. So, Pink Path. Two paintings here. The top one is the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone, which I may or may not have mentioned before, was America's first national park, Yellowstone. The lower painting is the most recent painting that I've done, in fact. I just finished this last week, about 8 days ago, I suppose. The first painting that I did was the Irish Boathouse, which, interestingly, was the first painting when you started filming this. This, I just called it Blue Reflections from North Carolina, simply because the place that I took the photograph from originally, that this was painted from, is called Linville Land Harbor Falls, and it's a bit of a mouthful, so I just called it Blue Reflections of North Carolina. There's one that we're going to get to in a minute, which is another of reflections of the same place. It's much larger, and it's called Green Reflections, but onto that later. This is Oregon, the coastline of Oregon, a lighthouse, obviously up here on the promontory. This was an interesting painting for me to undertake because working with water isn't always easy. And these were some powerful waves hitting those rocks. And you can't be timid. When you're doing something like that, if you're timid, you end up with nothing. So you've got to go for it with some gusto. So that's some very bright white paint there, and it's quite thickly applied, just as make a strong juxtaposition between the rock and the water. So as I mentioned earlier, this is also North Carolina. The one that I showed before was called Blue Reflections. This is called Green Reflections. Well, for obvious reasons, a lot of green now. This is interesting to me because when I first took this photograph, I didn't even think about painting it. And initially, believe it or not, I started painting from the photograph upside down, and I didn't even realize I had the photograph upside down. One of the ladies I painted with, she said, I don't think it goes that way. And I said, you're right, and I even took the photograph, so your eye can get fooled, can't it, by the camera, and so forth. I think I did say earlier that these works are from photographs, all that I've taken, and when you take a photograph, you don't always know necessarily what you're going to do with it, but in this instance, I turned it into a painting. And this shows the difference between a scintilla of change in light, because this photograph, or the photograph that I took to make this painting from, was taken just shortly before this one here, and you can see how much darker this is, so there was less sunlight there. This painting here is strictly from my imagination. It started off, I was going to do flowers and fruit, and then it just turned into some eyes and some shapes and so forth. Interestingly, it's one of those happy accidents that happen sometimes when you're painting. Something happens that you didn't necessarily intend to happen, and so it's been pointed out that these eyes here and this rather elongated sort of snouty thing and this stuff here resembles Groot, or possibly baby Groot. So here's another painting of the White Cliffs of Dover, this time with another subject inside. This is my husband Paul, and the painting originally, I changed it a bit. Originally the camera case was behind him and it became distracting, so I left the camera case out. The dog who wasn't there got added, and I had a little bit of help with the dog. I paint at a studio, and the lady who runs the studio saw I was having a hard time. In fact, there was much tittering going on in the studio because the dog originally looked like a cat, and people were saying, "Who's that cat?" And I said, "Not a cat, it's a dog." But anyway, that is how things mutate sometimes. This painting here is just called Magical Realism 1. I can't remember exactly where the photograph I took that I made the painting from was, so I just called it Magical Realism 1, Bridge in parentheses. The top painting is how our back garden used to look with the farm behind it, and I opted to do this painting because I'd never tried to paint snow before, and I thought it would be rather a challenge. And snow isn't really white at all, much as that seems a contrary thing to say. You have so many other colours that are reflected into snow that change the white aspect of it. One of the reasons we originally bought our house here in Elizabethtown was when we bought in '89, is because of the view behind the house. Our property ends here along the tree line, but that beautiful old barn and the farm behind the house was really a selling point for me. So that brings back a memory of that painting, and it just goes to show sometimes if you take a photograph, you paint from it, you preserve something for posterity that's actually long since gone. That farm, I so missed it. You would see the changing of the seasons as to where the sun would set behind that barn, and I loved it. But anyway, that's progress. The land was sold. It's no longer a farm now, but the painting brings back the memory. Here's another painting from Yellowstone. This is Clark's Fork, a place where some of the locals go to swim actually, and it's a lovely place to visit. Nice walk. This here is a printer's copy of an original. The original, the medium, was oil on parchment. The client who paid me to design this for him has the original, therefore I have a copy. You lose a little something in the copying process. These illuminated letters lose some of their pizzazz, but the actual representation of the calligraphy remains quite authentic to the original. And I also used a little bit of watercolour and ink on this to do the tree. And the gentleman who I painted this for wanted the Latin name for the tree in there, so I ran it longwise down there because it would have been too busy otherwise. As artists, you're always artists yourself. You always know that you're looking for ways to present your material in the way that it's going to be most appreciated by the audience. You don't want anything that's going to jump out at you. You really want something that's easy on the eye. So that all comes into your composition framework. This one above is a favourite poem of mine. It's called In Flanders Fields. It comes from the First World War, which incidentally my grandfather fought in World War I in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. This poem was written by a Canadian medic by the name of John McRae, who was working in a field hospital in the First World War. In France, well, the Flanders region, hence the name Flanders Fields. In the midst of all the death and the suffering, John McRae, the doctor, noticed that the poppies were still proliferating. There was still beauty there, even among the death. When he wrote this poem, In Flanders Fields poppies grow between the crosses row on row, he was seeing them coming up between the crosses of the recently dead soldiers. The poppy subsequently became the symbol of World War I, and to this day in Britain, and Veterans Day here we have it, same day. In England, they still wear the poppies, a little effigy of a poppy to raise money for soldiers still. It's interesting not only from the perspective of the poppies as being symbolic of both beauty and death, but also the way that this poem runs, and he talks about how regardless of how many people die, things go on. And he says, take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with those who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. So in other words, amidst all the death, beauty still through nature comes through. It's a very touching poem. So years ago when I was younger, I used to go on country walks with my father, who grew up in the country, so he was a wealth of information about badgers and squirrels and all manner of creatures. And when we would go on walks, I hardly ever would think to bring the camera, just because it was so much the norm to me that I didn't think to photograph it, which is a common mistake because beauty's all around us, but we don't always notice it just because it becomes commonplace. Anyway, this one particular day, I had the camera with me and I said to my dad, let me take a photo of you. So you've seen the photograph. Had I known at that time, I don't know, circa 1985, that one day I'd paint my father, I would have said, could you get your hands out of the picture and could you move your nose a little bit, because his nose presented a challenge. You want to talk about nose room? My father had it in spades. Hands are very difficult actually to paint, which is why very often portraiture is taken from the bust up. Again, I didn't ever know I'd paint my dad, and well, look at that face. I mean, Jimmy Durante, watch out. So if you know who Jimmy Durante is, but the thing is that nobody, in England it's a common put down. If somebody's rather unattractive, you might say, well, he or she's no oil painting. People would have said that of my father. However, literally, that's no longer true. He is an oil painting. This top piece is calligraphy, an illuminated letter with the S for sage, and sage, with its long history and many uses, has been esteemed for centuries as a memory enhancer. This was actually a piece I made for my husband years ago, and so I put the sage on there to remind him, well, that I felt very strongly for him. So. The bottom one here is a painting, so much as the medium here was ink on paper. This here is oil on panel. This is a friend who used to live on a farm. She no longer lives there. I wanted to preserve the happy memories that she had from when she lived on the farm, so I worked from a photograph. This was maybe the 4th or 5th painting I did, and when I gave it to her, she burst into tears. And I said, good heavens, it wasn't that bad, was it? She said, no. She said, you just moved me, because I remember being there when that photograph, or when the photograph was originally taken, and now I have the painting to remind me always, now that I no longer live there, of what it was like when I did live on the farm. And I suppose that's something that happens a lot now. I mentioned in a previous painting, there used to be a farm behind our house. Sometimes the old family farms are going now, so if you don't paint them or photograph them to preserve the memory. And it really means a lot to people when the art is personal. It touches in a way that is just so personal. This here is a little bit different in that it's acrylic paint on poster board, mat board rather. The colours are significant in that this was a logo designed for a client whose last name began with S. The background was Irish or Celtic, and the other individual was of Native American descent. So I did a little bit of research before I did this painting, and interestingly, both in Irish mythology and in some Native American Indian mythology, that bird is the same looking bird, but it's called two different things. Native American Indians call it the thunderbird, I believe, and I'm not sure what the Celts call it, but it actually looks the same, which sometimes happens with symbols, that different cultures share the same symbol, but it means something different depending on what that culture is and what its beliefs are. The colours I wanted to look vaguely South American, as in generically Native American Indian. I know that that's a sweeping, very broad statement, but in general terms, I wanted to show the difference between Southwestern colours and the more bold Celtic sort of colours. And also the lettering. This is a mixture of both painting and calligraphy, in that the letter L and a D, there is in Celtic lettering very often you don't have necessarily long ascenders. And yeah, it was just an interesting piece to do. I had fun doing it. Awesome. Another oil on panel from Yellowstone. This is a mountain jonquil. And just an interesting thing for me to do, in that I don't very often paint flowers, but that one, as the light hit it, which I tried to recreate in paint here, that sort of whitish streak that goes down there. Just a different avenue to try. Both of these paintings, oil on panel, are from Yellowstone. The top one is a little baby deer that was a distance away from the cabin that we were staying at, and it was very shy and nervous, so we took a long distance shot, with the camera. So it was a little bit out of focus, with the end result that this painting looked rather more impressionistic than some of the others, just because the photograph I was working from was pretty blurry, very skittish creatures for good reason. And there's sort of a funny story, I suppose, about how that photograph came to be taken. It was one of my first times to be in Yellowstone, and you get bears there. You remember actually when you're in Yellowstone that you are part of the food chain for the most part. You forget that when you're out there. You remember it. So my husband said to me, when you go out of the cabin in the morning, make a noise in case there are any bears hanging around. So I wasn't quite sure what he meant by make a noise, so I went out and I went and I heard this huge laugh from inside of the cabin, and my husband was saying, no, he said, when I said make a noise, I meant make a noise, bang a few saucepan lids together, yell or something. He said, sometimes you're just too English, even though you've lived here for 31 years, you're just still too English. So yeah, actually I became an American citizen in the year 2000, but nevertheless, sometimes I revert to type. Luckily though, I didn't make too much noise that morning, because if I had really shouted and hollered and thought there might be a bear there and attempted to deflect any bear, we wouldn't have got the deer, because the noise would have scared the deer away. So that was sort of a happy accident that we got him. Luckily, no bears. Here's another painting from Yellowstone. This is Soda Butte Creek. I have to think before I say that, because the first time I saw some of the names of famous landmarks in Yellowstone, or not so famous in this case, I mispronounced those names because I'd only seen them written down. If you haven't heard something said and you just read it, maybe you assume it's pronounced a certain way. So in the case of this, Soda Butte Creek, I thought it was Soda Butt Creek, and the famous geyser of Old Faithful, I was calling it a geyser, so I was talking about geysers and butts instead of geysers and buttes. Here's another oil on panel. This is of Leeds Castle in England. It's actually in the Kent countryside. That's the county in England that I grew up in. And this has been called, this castle, not my rendition of it, but in its actuality has been called the most beautiful castle in England. And it really is fabulous. If you're up close to it, you can see a lot more detail if you're there in the flesh looking at it, surrounded by a moat. Absolutely stunning. This is from a photograph that I took when I was a long distance back from the castle, because I wasn't so interested in the architecture as I was in the general ambience of the flow of the river and the shape of the trees in the foreground. So actually in this painting, the castle takes short shrift, or it's not so important as what is in the foreground of the painting, because that's what I chose to focus on, because that's what we do, isn't it? We tend to focus on that which is of the utmost interest to us individually. As I mentioned before, the media that I use are both oil on panel and ink on parchment. So the tools of the trade, what I need to use to create the effect that I want to in the artwork. We'll start with painting, because the majority of the work in this room are the paintings that I've painted from photographs that I've taken. But when I go through the process of transferring that image from the photo onto an oil painting, I'm going to first start off with my panel, okay? So this is the panel. It's actually masonite board. It doesn't come red, it actually comes that colour, that dun sort of colour. So I paint with a lady who studied art in Florence, Italy. I may have earlier said it was a Venetian idea. I meant to say it's a Florentine thing, at least the way that the lady I work in the studio with learned, in that in Florence, Italy, first of all, you do white, and then when the white paint is dried, white acrylic, you then put red. Presumably this red infuses more light and more body into the finished product. So for example, this painting of the White Cliffs behind me, originally this was one big long red board. I started off with an outline of the major shapes here, then did the sky first of all. This is what's called a happy brush. In that, it's a good name, isn't it? A happy brush. So you just sort of swipe away happily to blur your paint. You don't want hard lines here. So this is a combination of blues, pinks, whites, creams, and I've forgotten a whole bunch of different colours that subtly intermingle with one another after you've done your swiping process here with the happy brush. Thereafter, you start to go into more detail. Now, this is not a particularly expensive or good paintbrush, but it just goes to show the difference in some of the widths that you're going to be using when you do a painting like this. So this is for more detail when you're doing outlines. Interestingly, you're not just going across. You might think water, you'd go across. I don't know if you can see these lines here of reflection. That's very light white paint mixed with some turpentine, just to thin it out. And you're going to use your brush strokes downwards and acrosswards too. So you've got two different directions going on. Then, to write my name, I'm going to use a thinner brush. As a calligrapher, I suppose that's one of my favourite things to do, write my name at the bottom, but it's necessary to record it. And when I painted it, otherwise I might forget. So the photograph that this painting is done from was originally taken years ago, I don't know, maybe around 1980 on a walk with my dad, and I just wanted to preserve the memory, so here it is, all these years later in paint. So I use a thin brush to do my signature here, and to do some of the tiny little details that you see in the front, which are actually not very detailed, quite honestly. Now, with a paintbrush, it's an entirely different thing to doing calligraphy, and I'll show the difference in the way that you're going to handle your tool. So with this, I don't want everything too tight. I want some looseness here, so I'm just going to let the brush take on a little bit of a life of its own, do some of this kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, creative swirling, or just letting the brush take over a little bit, not trying to too tightly control what's going on. I'm not a great believer in too much control. I think it's better to just let things happen sometimes. Difference when we're working with a calligraphy, or when I'm working with a calligraphy pen, is that my tool of the trade here, I'm going to want a lot of control on this. I can't be doing this sort of number, a wishy-washy thing, otherwise the lettering would look horrible. You need much more control. You need uniformity for calligraphy to look good to the eye. You don't want big gaps in some places. You don't want dissonance. You want unity. So this is my tool of the trade for calligraphy. I didn't bring ink. We all know what ink looks like, and it's messy. I didn't want to bring it and drop it all over the shop. But let's just assume there's a little thing of ink here, and I'm going to do a dip. I often use a dip nib. And this is a very old-fashioned kind of pen. You can use much more up-to-date ones, whereby you just use a cartridge of ink and you put that into a pen. This is the old-fashioned way, a dip pen. And this, I'm going to unscrew this to show you the difference between two nibs that I might use, if I can ever get them out. Okay, so that's one kind of a nib that I can screw in. You can see this. Rather an unusual nib, that one. This one is a much more conventional nib in that I would use this to do Gothic, because I've got an angle on it, and if I want to get a thin line as opposed to a thick line, I'm going to tightly control the way that I use my pen here. So this is about, well, it's a very old way. I'm sure before these sort of dip pens, scribes used feathers, quills, and did a little bit of business where they could make a point and dip it in something that they used as an ink, probably, I don't know, some sort of a natural dye. Then you've got a progression of the tools that you're going to use for your trade. Now, these are pens that I quite often use just because they're convenient, they don't leak all over the place, they come in many colours, and they're permanent. This isn't an ad for Sharpie, it might sound like it, but actually it's, these are convenient to use. And I'll use a thinner calligraphy pen. This one has got a thicker nib on one end than the other end, so I'm just going to show you the difference in lettering that doesn't have a serif, okay? That's called sans serif. without serif. So let's start with Gina. And I'm going to, actually, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to whip these bracelets off because they're going to get in the way of my writing this. Here we go. So here's Gina sans serif, okay? This is Gina with the serifs, or the twiddly bits. That's not a technical term, but it works, okay? So that would be where I would do a little bit of fancy work on the ends of the letters. Are you picking that up? Does that show on? So much as I've had a background in art and have done different types of art in the past, i.e. graphic art, calligraphy and some other art forms, oil painting has come to me later in life. I started oil painting not even 2 years ago, about 18 to 20 months ago. So all of the oil paintings that you see in this gallery, the Morrison Gallery here at Elizabethtown Community and Technical College, has been completed in the last 18 to 20 months. I work from my own photographs. I embellish them or edit them or do what one does as an artist to make the end product as we want to see it. Some of the artwork that you see here on the walls is for sale, but I do accept commissions and I do private customised work for clients. The more information about that at the end as to how to contact me. In the execution of these paintings, some took longer than others. Not necessarily due to size, sometimes just because something's smaller doesn't mean that it took less time to complete. So the painting behind me took approximately 6 hours to paint, but that wasn't 6 consecutive hours because you have to leave oil for a while to dry, otherwise you're painting wet on wet and you can end up with a rather nasty muddy effect, which you definitely don't want. So this is an example of the largest painting in the gallery. Some of the smaller ones took as long to complete as this one did. This show runs through the 26th of March here at the Morrison Gallery. And more information about how to contact me should you want a piece of your own artwork created, that information will be available at the end of this video. Thank you. Thank you so much.